most of us are bitter over someone, setting fire to our insides for fun, to distract our hearts from ever missing out. But I'm forever missing him. And you call.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to stage Chief Executive of NHS Confederation, Niall Dickson, and Chair of NHS Confederation, Stephen Doyle.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the last session of the first day of Confed 17. I hope you've enjoyed the sessions so far, feel that they've been informative, instructive, and given you value to take back to your organisations. But the next session is a key session for the Confederation. It's my very, very great pleasure to introduce our still relatively new Chief Executive, Niall Dickson. There is something faintly ridiculous about me introducing Niall Dickson to a health audience. There are not many people in the health and care world who've been in it longer than I have, but Niall is one of them. The Nursing Standard, the BBC, the King's Fund, the General Medical Council, there is quite literally nobody who has seen our health and care system from more different points of view than Niall has, and he is therefore perfectly equipped, in my view, to lead the Confederation through these next few years, and I certainly, and I'm sure you are too, I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say to us about the challenges we face and how to chart a course through them. Please welcome back to the stage Niall Dickson.
Well, a very good afternoon, and thank you very much for being here. We know it's difficult to find time to attend conferences, but to lead, you need time to reflect, you need to test out ideas, to compare and exchange views, and that's what we hope these few days can provide for all of us. In my first few months in this role, I've started to go around and meet some of our members, and what I'm going to say now reflects what I've heard. The Confederation's job is to reflect your concerns. That's what we're here for. We've been reminded today of what remarkable things are being achieved by the NHS. We'll hear later in this session about the response to the attacks in Whitehall, Manchester, and at London Bridge. This was the health service at its best. One chief executive in Manchester sent me an email which ended, "We are stronger than those who seek to harm us." And I think that was a very fitting tribute in a way to what had happened following the awful events in Manchester. And as if, frankly, we needed reminding, today's horrendous fire again demonstrated how the health service must always be ever prepared. But I want to reflect just in a wider sense that this is an opportune moment for our NHS, partly because we're at the dawn of a new, if somewhat fragile, UK Parliament. For this is surely a time for our political leaders to pause for thought. There is a chance now to reset the clock and think through what can be achieved in the coming months and years. Certainly, I think within this audience and within the wider NHS, this is a time of greater reflection, a realization that we are moving into a different future, a different phase in the development of our health service. Robert Rabbieburns, oft-quoted dictum or plea, has never really seemed more pertinent. Oh, would some power the gift to give us to see ourselves as others see us. At all levels, we need to put ourselves in the position of others and rise above traditional sectional interest. The divisions between commissioner and provider, between acute and community, between community and primary care, between NHS care and that which is publicly funded and that which is provided by the independent and voluntary sectors. In their different ways, these schisms have hampered health and care services for too long, and we have a chance now, I believe, to put them aside. I want to begin, though, by reflecting on where we've got to. The last 5 years have seen the largest increase in our population since 1945. More people obviously means more health need. Yet funding growth, as you are all aware, from 2009 has been lower than at any time since the health service was founded. And that's before we consider the astonishing and wonderful story of aging. Between 1995 and 2000, there were 100,000 more people aged over 65. Between 2010 and 2015, the number of old people in the UK grew by 1.3 million. We have seen a step change in demand. And actually, the surprising part of this story has been the resilience of the NHS. The fact that in spite of record demand, our National Health Service has coped, and throughout the UK has continued to provide good care to millions. As Jim Mackey explained earlier, the books have also been balanced. So the positives and the reason to celebrate, if not to be cheerful, are worth repeating. The Health Secretary's pointed out we have record cancer survival rates. We have some of the highest dementia diagnosis rates in the world. Hospital-acquired infection, once the scourge of our system, has been tackled, leaving us with among the lowest rates in Europe. And the proportion of patients in England who say their NHS care is good has risen by 13% over the last 4 years. But the strains are also all too evident. Waiting lists and times are rising. Access to GPs is becoming more difficult. And all over the country, bed occupancy is too high, and patients are stuck in hospital beds, not because they're sick, but because there's nowhere for them to go. It cannot be right that a child with significant mental health issues may have to wait up to 6 months for specialist help. It can't be right either that we must turn our backs on the amazing achievement of 18-week maximum waits, or go back to a world where hospitals are routinely operating at 91% bed occupancy. So what's to be done? Unless we act now, the service will deteriorate further. And what I want to suggest is that as a society, we desperately need a national conversation to agree a vision for the future for our health and our care services, and a conversation that begins by recognizing the scale of the coming challenge. There will be another 1 million people over 65 by 2020, then another 1.3 million on top of that by 2025, and a further 1.7 million on top of that by 2030. The over 85s, again, clearly a group that will impose even greater strain on the health service, they are set to double within 20 years. So again, cause for celebration, but let us be realistic about the coming demand. We know the strength of feeling among the public about our health and care services. I think that was evident in the election campaign. And yet, as those of us, I think, who are at least close to this area would reflect, the level of debate was pretty poor, and the scale of the challenge was not addressed. I think this is an opportunity for politicians across the political divide at least to recognise the need to put both health and care on a more sustainable footing. Of course, we can't ignore the economic realities or the vulnerability of the UK administration post-election, or how far its room for manoeuvre may be constrained. The distraction of Brexit and the constraints of parliamentary numbers mean that government may be tempted not to take bold decisions or to tackle issues such as social care. On the other hand, these constraints may present an opportunity. This government will have to work differently, finding areas of agreement on issues that matter most to the electorate, and that clearly includes the NHS and social care. So our message to the politicians is that when it comes to the NHS, we have to stop launching the life rafts and start fixing the ship. There are three fundamental challenges: money, transformation, and workforce. On the money, I think the message is simple. We don't currently have the resources to deliver what the public expects. In England, health spending per head has been flat since 2009 and has fallen slightly elsewhere in the UK, while, as I've said, demand has risen inexorably. Per head spending in England over the next 5 years will likely rise by at most 1.2%. Compare that with the 4% historical average, and even that 4% left this country behind many other comparable systems. It also means that health spending is likely to continue to fall as a percentage of GDP. Now, as many of you will know, during the election, we argued that government should commit to setting a GDP target for health spending, thereby placing it on the same footing as defence and international aid. This would be a transparent commitment to fund our NHS, a visible benchmark which government can boast about and defend, and which allows those who use and pay for the service to hold the NHS to account. It's a recognition, too, that as the economy grows, so too should our investment in health and care. But what's the right level, and can we afford it? The Office for Budget Responsibilities projection is that to meet rising demand, NHS spending in England could rise at around 4.5% a year in real terms. And the Nuffield suggests that would mean spending at around 155 billion in 22-23. That's nearly 31 billion more than this year. But rather than the politicians doing what they did during the election, which is trading promises in billions, we urgently need an objective assessment of what the service needs, both in the short term and over the coming decade. Such an assessment might not secure political consensus, but at least it would expose the scale of the challenge, and the ensuing debate would be on evidence, not speculation. But while more resources are necessary, they are clearly not sufficient. There is now agreement, I would say across the UK, but also probably across the developed world, that without changing the way we deliver care, current systems are not sustainable. That's the underlying message of the 5-year forward view and its sequel, and we remain committed to this vision in England. In Wales, they have the drive for prudent healthcare, and in Northern Ireland, the Bengoa report. All these initiatives point to the need for a more joined up and a more integrated future. The challenge is obvious: how do we get there? The sustainability and transformation partnerships, as we must now call them, have proved extremely challenging. In part, I think this is because they require leaders to set aside organizational interests in favor of the system as a whole. And that is easier to promise than to deliver, especially when you're still being held to account organizationally. It's made difficult because the regulatory and the accountability mechanisms that govern providers and commissioners are not always aligned. They continue in law, and too often in practice, to be focused on the organizational rather than the system performance. And in reality, the S of sustainability can simply overwhelm the tea of transformation. Just trying to keep some systems afloat is difficult enough without requiring it to transform. And it's made harder still because change requires clinical and public support. In some hard-pressed economies, genuine attempts to create services based on new models of care can be viewed as nothing more than cuts designed to save money. Now, with an unequivocal election result, we might have hoped that politicians at national and at local level would be more willing to back radical change and new models of care at the start of this political cycle. That seems less likely now. Yet we must continue to make the case for reform, even if political courage is in short supply. The opportunity for legislative reform has likewise been made more difficult by the parliamentary arithmetic. There's no appetite for a re-go at the Health and Social Care Act, and given a hung Parliament and the looming Brexit negotiations, we have to accept that it won't be easy to secure health legislation. Nevertheless, we believe there is scope for tidying up the current legal framework, in the absence of which it's NHS leaders and NHS staff who have to keep on coming up with even more ingenious workarounds. We polled a panel of our members, and 94% of them agreed that the current structures are not fit for purpose. So what we should expect and demand, however, is that this is the moment for politicians and communities to engage constructively in shaping the future of our local services. In exchange, we believe that our members will continue to show commitment to reform and to work with partners, not least local government, to redesign services to cope with the demands of the 21st century. And this will include work to reduce clinical variation, rationalize acute services, merge back office functions, and eliminate or reduce delayed transfers of care and other blockages in the system. The goal has to be to create new forms of integrated services which use data to stratify populations, which focus relentlessly on managing demand by keeping people as healthy as possible in or near their own homes, and which tear down the barriers that have blighted effective care and cooperation in the past. I think it includes establishing a new compact with primary and community care so that we ensure that patients receive the right care in the right place at the right time. And it has to include a partnership with our staff so that they are involved along with patients and communities in redesigning services. As one of the digital gurus observed, the future is already with us. The Vanguard projects are beginning to show what can be done with investment and support. Case studies published at this conference show that it's possible to improve performance against the 4-hour target, reduce the number of hospital stays longer than 14 days, reduce psychiatric admissions, triage thousands of calls without emergency services, and much more. The Wakefield District Vanguard has looked to support residents in care homes and those who might have to go into a care home. In one scheme, the percentage of tenancies terminated as a result of admission into residential or nursing care went from 38% to 0 since the Vanguard support. Now, I know I've focused largely on the challenges in England, but virtually all those issues are experienced elsewhere in the UK. There are lessons to be learned from all these systems. And as colleagues in Northern Ireland will testify, structure is not everything. Just having joint health and care organisation does not guarantee truly integrated services. And the third major challenge, well, Bill Clinton said it's the economy is stupid. I think we might say it's the workforce stupid. As one CEO said during our regional meetings, we've absorbed pressure through the goodwill of the workforce, but we are starting to creak. As NHS Employers has proposed, there does need now to be movement in the pay cap for all staff as a contribution to retention. And of course, in our view, it should be funded by government. The number of advertised vacancies in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland is growing year on year. According to the RCN, 40,000 registered nursing staff have gone missing in England. Nurses and doctors are having to work rotas with gaps that cannot be filled, and we remain too dependent on agency staff. Doctors, nurses, and other professionals who come here from other countries are critical to our success. They have brought expertise and insight, and they've enriched our health service and our country. But it's fair to say that for too long, we've been over-dependent on overseas recruitment. We've not trained enough of our own. Movement of health professionals around the world is inevitable and positive. But it behoves, I think, an advanced economy such as ours to train enough for our needs, accepting that some will go, at least for a while, and we will benefit from others coming here in return. The nature of training also needs to change. We have to start preparing health professionals for the very different needs and expectations of the 21st century. A world in which professional boundaries will be more permeable and staff at all levels need to be more flexible. New types of workers should be encouraged, and much better use of the skills of existing professionals such as pharmacists, GPs, specialist consultants, and community nurses should be made use of. We're now living through what Thomas Friedman described as the age of acceleration. It's not just that we face unprecedented change, but that the pace of change is faster and faster. And that will mean not only training new types of staff to meet new and different needs, it means training and retraining our existing workforce for new roles and new challenges, recognizing that their ambitions and aspirations will often be different from those of their predecessors. So we look forward to the workforce plan from Health Education England, and there is a very obvious and immediate ask of government. We had a good session this morning on the potential impact of Brexit and the guarantees we need to secure as a health system in the upcoming negotiations. The position of EU nationals in the UK needs to be dealt with at the outset. For us, this is fundamental. We have seen already that uncertainty about the future is affecting the 60,000 NHS staff from the EU. The inflow has already begun to dry up, and there are those that are here who fear for their future. So we need clarity on funding. We need political courage on transformation and a new approach on securing and supporting our workforce. The political and financial environment in which we're all operating is difficult and uncertain, but we can unite around a vision for a new health and care system. And as we approach the 70th anniversary of this great service, we should celebrate the achievements of the past and set out a vision of what can be achieved in the future. I do hope being here over these couple of days provides you with some headroom to reflect and a chance to share your good practice and learn from others. Transformation will be built on managers and clinicians coming together to agree a way forward and share ideas and lessons that work. At the Confederation, we're committed to doing what we can to support you to face these awesome challenges. The success of the Confederation depends on engaging with our members. And in the coming year, Stephen and I, together with the entire leadership team of the Confederation Group, will aim to reach out to understand the challenges you face in the front line. We believe that our ability to bring the whole system together will be crucial in the coming weeks and months. Our Confed Group brings together networks and offices that represents different parts of our membership, including NHS Clinical Commissioners, NHS Employers, the Mental Health Network, the NHS Partners Network, as well as our offices in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and in Europe, in Brussels. Confed 17 is a great showcase of this, and we're very proud that we have the established health conference for the service. But we don't take this for granted. We made some changes this year based on feedback from last year, and we will keep doing this. So please do let us know what you value and what you think we could better. I'm enormously grateful for the support of our partners. Allocate Software have been strong backers for some time, and we're delighted to have their continuing support this year for the whole conference week. Thanks also to NHS Digital, Optum, MS Health, HFMA, Newton Europe, and NHS professionals for their backing on the programme. We also have a fringe programme this year that runs straight after this session and first thing tomorrow morning. This will have more discussion on the big issues, and if you can spare 1 more hour with us today, please do take part. They're on the top floor. I'm determined that over the course of the coming year, the NHS Confederation will become ever more responsive to our members and place you at the heart of everything we do. I very much hope we can achieve that together. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. You never disappoint. Calm, authoritative, a voice that is respected within the service and beyond. It's why you played such an important part in the public debate at the beginning, at least, of the election campaign. Thank you indeed for what you had to say this afternoon. We want now to put in an additional session. We've referred several times today to the contribution, the commitment, and the heroism of NHS staff in the response to the terrorist incidents recently in both Manchester and London. We want to do 2 things. We want to show you another short film, and then we want to ask you to recognize not the abstract, but the specifics of some of the people whose heroism we've recognized today. But first, a film.
Good morning. In Manchester, a suicide bombing at a pop concert last night killed 22 people and wounded nearly 60 others.
After our darkest of nights, Manchester is today waking up to the most difficult of dawns.
What we saw on the night was real determination, resilience, teamwork, staff really coming up with what was required to deliver the best care for these patients.
I was inundated with messages from the team. Can I come in? Do you want me in? That came from healthcare assistants, nurses, allied health professionals, doctors, consultants, offering to come in and support us. And we did take up an offer on a fair few.
I was in bed asleep but have the radio on, and I must have just registered the words incident in Manchester. Found out that it was a major incident that had happened, so the next thing I did was ring in work.
I want to thank the hundreds of police, fire and ambulance staff who worked through the night in the most difficult circumstances imaginable.
A white van driver came speeding probably about 50 miles an hour, veered off the road into the crowds of people that were walking.
According to NHS England, there are currently 14 people being treated here at King's College Hospital.
Well, there were multiple patients coming off across the bridge towards us, and we later became aware that there were other patients still on the south side of the bridge who were being treated there. But what we saw was really extraordinary of just members of the public, police force and some paramedics who had already been on the scene, just literally running the length of London Bridge carrying patients, which is not easy to do, and just getting people out to safety and towards us.
I want to express my gratitude on behalf of all Londoners to the police and emergency services who've shown tremendous bravery in exceptionally difficult circumstances.
It's the day after, really, when feelings settle in. Just want to focus on the good things that I saw, the good care that I saw, and that for me speaks about the night, not the bad things that went on.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we can't possibly invite all the people who made that care possible on those nights, but we can invite their representatives so that we can say thank you to them in person, and so that we can hear a little bit of their experiences of that evening, of those evenings. So please welcome the following people. Nicola Pratt, who was duty manager for Northwest Ambulance Fire Service. Stephanie Kennedy, who was consultant clinical psychologist for the Greater Manchester Mental Health Foundation Trust. Dan Smith, consultant paramedic for Greater Manchester for the Northwest Ambulance Service. Gabby Lomas, matron in emergency medicine in Salford Royal NHS Trust. Matthew Davenport, consultant in emergency medicine for the Salford Royal NHS Trust. And Dr. Hazel Bennett, consultant clinical psychologist at the Greater Manchester Mental Health Foundation Trust.
Okay, we've got a chance for a brief chat with Stephanie Kennedy, who's a consultant clinical psychologist at Greater Manchester Mental Health Foundation Trust, and Dan Smith, who's a consultant paramedic for Greater Manchester Northwest Ambulance Service. So if I can begin with you, Stephanie, can you just describe what your role has been in the incident?
So my role was the easy bit, really, in terms of I was called upon to coordinate some of the psychological staff to offer support both to some of the victims and also to the staff who'd been involved in providing frontline services.
And that was for people who'd been at the scene itself, or was it about relatives, or both?
It was primarily the victims who'd been admitted to the hospitals, and then subsequently to staff who'd been dealing with those victims and supporting them in terms of helping them to understand what might have been their response following the
what
incident.
about support for staff themselves?
So, yeah, we provided a number of things. I mean, the basic message that we were given was that staff have the resilience to cope with these sorts of things, and we just went in there, gave people an opportunity to just talk about their experience, but the main message was just about psychoeducation in terms of this is what you might expect over the next sort of hours, weeks, days, and just giving people some education about if they were struggling, where they could access help and support.
I think it was one doctor saying that when you're actually doing the incident, that's not when it hits you, it's afterwards it really starts to, the bang, the psychological bang really happens.
Absolutely, and I think that's the thing, we're generally well equipped to just sort of get on in situations like this and to be able to respond. And then it's afterwards often when things calm down and people have a chance to start to process things that when reality hits. And I think the message that we were trying to give to staff and to managers was about just trying to provide opportunities for staff groups to get together as a group of peers and to literally just have time to support each other. So it wasn't, at one level, terribly sophisticated. It was just about reassurance, education, signposting, really.
Really interesting. Dan, what about your role?
So initially, obviously, I attended on the incident to the attack and attended quite quickly, so I was second on scene and took an incident command role. I was relieved to see one of my senior commanders arrive about an hour later to take over that senior command role. And
that must have been quite traumatic. I mean, for you personally, finding yourself in charge of that thing at that moment.
I think so. We clearly do a lot of planning and a lot of preparation, and we've been fortunate or fortuitous that we'd practiced a very similar type of incident actually only 2 weeks previously. So we were aware of the systems, what we needed to get done that night. I think probably the big thing for me was actually my team became much bigger that night. We had a team of security staff at the arena, we had a team of medics at the arena. You know, all of a sudden we had to very quickly work out how we were going to work together, and worked well.
And in terms of your working life, you see lots of things that most of us never see. Is this different? And especially there were lots of young people involved, obviously. Is that more traumatic?
I think the visual impact of that night is different, but the psychological impact is very different. And we were talking before, actually, I think when we write plans for these incidents and when we exercise these incidents, we stop when the incident is finished. And actually, the next 24 to 48 hours was actually the most difficult for us and us as a team. And we plan in the ambulance service not very well for those next 24, 48 hours. In terms of, this was an attack on our city, it was an attack on a place where nearly everybody in Greater Manchester has been at some point. There was a very, very large press and media interest in it, so all of a sudden the personal stories from that incident were being directed at us through our phones, through the television. So that impact, the gravity, made a big difference to us, I think.
And how people talk about the planning is very important. You've tried the stuff out before. Is that does that kind of mean that you are able to get on with what you need to do?
I think the planning that we put in place, especially as a network, you know, we were a very small part of a very large NHS team that night, and we're joined by colleagues from one of the trauma centres, that the planning we put in place clearly gave us the direction. But on the night, you can't plan for everything. You know, decisions had to be made very quickly. But actually, the big benefit I saw was that we all know each other. We work well together. We've done that groundwork. So on the night, we all knew what each other's role was.
Okay.
I think for me, the most moving thing that I've heard you say, and I'm sure it's true, is that you found yourself almost first there, but you were there as part of a team that grew quickly. And we saw on one of the clips on the film a nurse who was off duty, and her first reaction was to pick up the phone and say, what do I do? Where do I report to? What do I need to do to help? So it was a team that grew, and that's a learning that we should repeat and of which we should be extremely proud.
I think you're right, and I think actually as part of planning for all of us, for the acutes as well, that immediacy, and because it was such a big media thing, that immediacy of information getting through meant that our teams did grow very quickly, but actually also for planning, that needs to be thought about, because we need to think about tomorrow. So are these people due in tomorrow? Can theatre lists go ahead tomorrow? What's going to be the impact of all this staff coming in?
And what we clearly need to do is to ensure that we learn that it was a brilliant success story from the point of view of the emergency services, but we can always look at ways of doing it better if, pray God, there isn't, but we should prepare for the fact that there's likely to be another such occasion. Because as you say, it was an attack on Manchester. It was also an attack on our way of life. And we need to ensure that our response is even better next time.
Can I say, well, ask the audience just to thank all of these staff for coming out here today and reminding us in many ways why we're here. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
I now go on to the next session. Ladies and gentlemen, I said at the beginning of this session that it was our final session, and it is now definitively our final panel of the day. I'd like to ask you, please, to welcome names that will need no introduction, frankly, to any of you. Professor Chris Ham, who's the Chief Executive of the King's Fund, Jennifer Dixon, Chief Executive of the Health Foundation, Nigel Edwards, Chief Executive of the Nuffield Trust, Amanda Doyle, who's Chair of the NHS Commissioners Group, and Julian Hartley, who's Chief Executive of the Leeds Teaching Hospitals. And the exam question at the beginning of this session is that there's a Queen's speech will be delivered sometime. We're not yet quite sure when, What would you, Jennifer, put in that Queen's speech for the first 100 days of the new government?
Well, firstly, assuming there is a new government, and that is a big question, it would be nice. Money, obviously. Don't think there's going to be a summer budget, but let's see. I suspect it's too difficult, so let's imagine the autumn. 5-year forward view, back it. Interesting role for politicians with the reconfiguration plans around. As all the journalists are saying, the job just got harder for reconfig. Question is, as was put to a panelist earlier, what should the Secretary of State do? I think there's a big role, given this is Jeremy Hunt, to probably stay under the waterline on this, but facilitate a lot bigger conversation about reconfigurations, or at least make sure that that happens. Third is about workforce. EU nationals guarantee those NHS staff, 7% of them, particularly the nurses. We don't know if there's Drexit, doctor exit. We know that looks as if there is nurse exit at the moment. So guarantee those. Fourth, I think, keep up the pressure on social care and trying to get some kind of solution. That can't be ducked, even though the politics is wobbly at the moment. And fifthly, this is my own pet subject, is I do think, the digital information infrastructure we have made progress, but it's not working, is it, for us yet? And if we really are to make efficiencies, we need to know a lot more about what's happening, using information and data analytics and so on. I don't know about you, but we can't get enough data out of the system at the moment to do basic analyses, and then we can't be the only ones. So I would say those 5 things, but to have a government in the first place would be a nice thing.
It's a good start. Nigel, what would you add to that shopping list of 5 transformative measures?
5 is probably already too many, isn't it? But I agree. I would agree with all of those. I think that the one that worries me most is the workforce. It does appear that the whole workforce planning system is significantly broken. I don't see any major attempts to fix it. I haven't seen any answers. It's at least a bigger problem as the money. It's not entirely clear what government can do, but I would definitely agree with Jennifer that we need to guarantee the position of the current EU nationals, but we also need to change the rhetoric more generally about whether we welcome migrants or not. There's a slightly nasty strand to quite a bit of the rhetoric that we hear, to some extent from the Prime Minister, I have to say, and I think that we'd like to see that reversed. The one thing that Andrew Lansley probably got right, and this is a controversial view to even suggest that
there are better introductions
there was one. But the big insight he had was, in a sense, the Ronald Reagan insight, which is there are very few problems from which central government intervention is the answer. And his idea that to try and get a better settlement between the NHS and the arm's length bodies, and a much clearer division of responsibility, and to try and detoxify the chain of bad behaviour and bullying that seems to infect the NHS. When we look at it from the outside, we think it looks totally toxic. Many of the people in it seem to have become inured to it. So there may not be anything that government can do to actually stop that, but they can help by continuing to rethink what that relationship ought to look like.
Well, we have 2 people on the panel who work hands-on day by day in the health service. So, Amanda, how do you react to that comment?
So, yes, but I think some of what we're needing for, so we need the system to change a bit. It's not working entirely as it is. We recognise that the commissioning system needs to develop. We just need an ask to not lose the clinical leadership and the clinical input to the decision making and the local engagement and involvement that we've had, even though we do need to scale things up, and STPs are a good start. I think we do need cash, but I think we need to be really clear that we need to ring fence that for transformation. Giving us cash which goes to soak up deficits isn't going to let us make the change we need to make. And I suspect we can't ask for much in the Queen's speech. A lot of what we need is behaviours from the government. But if there's anything that we can ask legislatively We need something, even if it's very small, that allows us to progress accountable care, get rid of some of those barriers to integration that we're currently working around and skating very close to the line on around competition and tariff.
The legislative agenda is about the migration, isn't it, from the original version of CCG to the revised version of STPs that have a different scale, a different role, and engage beyond the NHS with local government?
Absolutely, and get rid of some of those barriers to do it, because at the moment, because of the current setup, what we're having to do is try to do a new world and carry on doing the old stuff as well, and we need to just let ourselves move on. And really, really importantly, as part of developing STPs and their plans, is to give us some backing for the difficult decisions we have got to make. It will make it 10 times harder if we get constant political opposition to things that we know are really difficult and challenging, but we've got to make those decisions.
That being discriminatory, Chris, can I go to Julian next on just Nigel's point on the culture within the health service and your experience of your relationship with arm's-length bodies and the extent to which you think that's an issue in your daily experience?
Yeah, okay, I'll come to that, Stephen. I think one thing I wanted to address straight away, which links to what you've just seen in terms of the fantastic contribution of those colleagues from Manchester and London. I just want to make sure we all understand that from a hospital provider perspective, we're in a challenging and uncertain time in British society in terms of everything that's going on at the moment. If there's one thing that governments can do, it's set the tone, it's create a sense of community cohesion and support us to do that across all of our communities. Because last Thursday in Leeds, we had a bomb scare. We had to evacuate a hospital. We had patients in the car park as a result of a suspect device. I had members of staff coming to me and worrying about what this meant, where we were going, what was happening. And I think here and now, we're in an uncertain world. The NHS is a crucial part of British society. And the question's about the government and in the first 100 days. And what we know from the election is that there's a large number of people that want a progressive agenda that's about investment, that's about coming together as a community, and is not about division and fracture. And the NHS can play a part in that, which brings me on to the second point, which is about, so how do we do that? It's clear we need investment, and I would hope that the outcome of the election in the first 100 days, government, Treasury will be rethinking their plans for the NHS in terms of the investment. And I'm talking specifically about capital, because hospitals are struggling day in, day out with creaking infrastructure. And certainly in terms of IT, we saw the impact of the cyber attack. Certainly in terms of the level of backlog maintenance there is in a number of our major hospitals, this needs attention. The integration and link with primary care and community services requires capital investment to deliver the ambitions of STPs. Those are the, I think, key priorities for us. And Nigel's point about ALBs, you know, I think we need help and support, and we need to set the right tone in terms of how we take the lessons from today's CQC report about improving hospitals. It's all about culture. It's all about engaging frontline teams, and it's all about the kind of attitude and response you've just seen from those colleagues that were involved in the Manchester attack. And that's what we need right now to get through a tough time.
On the specifics of the need for capital investment to keep the estate and the infrastructure up to date, that's presumably something that could be addressed. I speak as a former Treasury Minister. If the Treasury was agreed to set aside some of the health budget for the Transformation Fund that Amanda was advocating, would that respond to
yeah,
your
I mean, I think we certainly need a bigger response than the amount of capital that was announced some months ago for STPs. I mean, we could use that in West Yorkshire alone, never mind across the whole country. And if we're going to accelerate and reinvigorate the changes as part of the 5-year forward view and the plans across different STPs, none of that will happen. Certainly acute reconfiguration can't happen without some of that investment. And colleagues up and down the land in acute hospital settings are struggling with a level of underinvestment because of the parlous state of capital and of infrastructure, and that needs urgent attention.
So, Chris, you heard Julian advocate a progressive agenda, and I thought that was a perfect cue, given your history. How would you write a health programme for 100 days?
So I think the message from last Thursday from the electorate was we need hope and not fear. And we need a Queen's speech which is about hope and not fear. I think two aspects of that. The other messages from the electorate were there's no mandate for a hard Brexit. So we need a Brexit which will help and support the NHS and social care, not hinder it, particularly around workforce. The electorate also said we've had enough of austerity and constraints and cuts in public spending. So I'd endorse what has been said already about we will need more investment, capital and revenue, but it must be, as Amanda said, investment for reform, changing and strengthening our care models, not sustaining a system which frankly is working to its limits. Some of that will be really hard. You know, the election result in Canterbury, concerns there about reconfiguration in East Kent that will not have gone unnoticed in Westminster or indeed in Whitehall, but we do need reconfiguration. So to go back to the attack on London Bridge, lives were saved because there is a trauma network in London. There are specialist hospitals that are there to provide fantastic care, as we saw around that terrible event. If there hadn't been a trauma network, we wouldn't have done so well. And yet that didn't come about without some difficulty of negotiation and concentrating our precious specialist services in fewer hospitals able to provide great care. There are local examples all around the country, A&E, maternity to name but two of those. But the politics of this, and you don't need me to say this to you, Stephen, are really, really difficult. The other point, I think, is about legislation. There was a promise in the manifesto on legislation. That will not happen now. There isn't a majority for legislation. Legislation would be a lightning rod for the opposition parties to attack the government and its stewardship of the NHS. So we're having to migrate towards accountable care systems and STPs in a system that wasn't designed to make that the easy thing to do. It's not impossible, but at some point there will need to be a Queen's speech, not this one, that will say how that can be achieved. But the message must be hope, not fear.
And Canterbury is the new Kidderminster was a little bit your message, wasn't it?
Yes.
And that it will give pause for thought. Now, one of the routes through those difficult questions that's been advocated is that less focus on national plans and more focus on local initiatives. In other words, look horizontally for your support for change rather than looking for permission from on high. And I wonder, Nigel, do you buy that? Do you think that the developed STP can be the basis of a broader case for change in a health economy?
Well, I think we've got examples both ways. I mean, so I think back to changes in East and North Hertfordshire over the last 15 years where very successful change has been done with the support of local government. We can think of alternative examples. I don't think it's a magic bullet. If you've got the wrong, if you haven't got the right local politicians, you're no better off than if you've got the wrong nationalists. I mean, part of the problem, if we're absolutely honest though, we make these statements that we need to do reconfiguration. That when you actually look at the case that we're sometimes making, it's by no means as convincing as we inside the healthcare system like to think. I think there's a strong suggestion, for example, that our growing problem with infant mortality is due to our very short lengths of stay in maternity. If we do more reconfiguration of maternity, that we may get more of that. The arguments that centralising acute medicine produces improvements in outcomes are not made, and I wonder whether we're a bit overconfident about the case and whether people sometimes see through what we're really saying, which is, actually, we can't afford to run all these services, we can't staff them. That's a much less compelling message, and we might be therefore less surprised that people get behind it than they do over more obvious cases like stroke and cancer, where we can actually stand those arguments up much more strongly.
And Jennifer, do you think that we face a need for change, partly for cost management purposes, but actually we've got a different type of demand being placed on the health and care system. So the government before the election was committed to a green paper on social options for reform of social care funding. Is that presumably has to be on the agenda, remain on the agenda. There isn't an escape from the bind in which we find ourselves that doesn't involve returning to the social care agenda, is there?
It has to happen because we all know the knock-on effects of the poverty of social care funding at the moment on the National Health Service, not least, let alone the suffering that it's causing in the community. What is it, 500,000 people no longer receive care that would have received had former trends applied from 2009, for example, and we're seeing the knock-on effect. I don't think that means, I think I heard Neil say earlier, I don't think that really means a reopening of the NHS settlement, by the way. I have a group every few, I don't know if you two do, but I have a group every few weeks coming into my office saying, will we fund a commission into the future, a royal commission on the future of the NHS? And I'm saying, no. Well, what's the reason? And every time I hear the reasons, I can anticipate them and fend them off. So I haven't heard any good reasons yet.
They told me that you were funding it, and they said,
no. No, I don't think so. Social care is really first in line. The other thing I wanted to say, if you don't mind me saying, is absolutely right about capital infrastructure, but there is something about human capital infrastructure here. We all know, don't we, that change mechanisms, supporting people, changing the culture, require investment and training, not least. And we kind of forget that. There's a rush to tech, there's a rush to capital for good reasons, but the human side of things is not really developed. And we all know, looking at the CQC report, looking at Virginia Mason, looking at all the high-performing systems we want to look at, they have a deep embedded infrastructure in continuous learning. Unless we can crack that, and the issue that I thought that Jim made a fantastic presentation today, but one of the things he said was, like, in the short term, we've got to get to grips with the finances, sure, and looks as though the tanker's turning a bit. But if that means that the long-term paving stones aren't placed in order to build that infrastructure, we're going to be in this problem again, even if we have a sticking plaster in the autumn.
Right, I'm going to turn now, as if I can see anyone, to people with the paddles. Please, is there somebody in the audience who would like to tell us what should be in the 100-day programme for the new government? Yes, number one here, thank you.
Hello, I'm Dave Shields, Councillor in Southampton, and thank you very much for the complimentary invitation as the Chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board. My question is, I've heard a few times today about how important it is to get local government on side to support the transformation. Now, I'm one of those rare creatures that sort of finds myself on the Corbyn-leaning wing of the Labour Party, but being criticised for not condemning our STP. And I just wondered what incentives are there for those of us in local government at local level who do want to step up to the mark, because at the moment there seem to be very few and far between.
Julian, in Leeds, what's been your experience of the relationship with local government?
Very positive. And we talk about, we don't call it the STP in Leeds, we call it the Leeds Plan, but it's essentially bringing together all of the partners across the city, and ultimately all of this goes through the Health and Wellbeing Board, and as Chair of a Health and Wellbeing Board, you'll know how important it is to have that oversight across all partners. Of course, then there's the West Yorkshire level, and we're working collaboratively with all local authorities across West Yorkshire, with the West Yorkshire Association of Acute Trusts, which I chair. But there's a recognition that all of the solutions and all of the challenges we face, not least the interface between health and social care, rely on an intimate understanding of each other's challenges and issues, and that means working hard at those partnerships. But ultimately, however good those STP plans are, they need to be backed, and they need to have some upfront investment in order to get them moving. And for the reasons I talked about earlier, that's certainly something that I think we need to see happen as part of the government's early programme.
Isn't it also part of the role that local government can play in this process, that it gives greater political engagement you were looking for a progressive agenda, a political agenda, using the health service to catalyse a different approach. And that's something that can, in truth, only be legitimated, ultimately, by elected politicians, and that is something that local government can bring to the party.
That is absolutely right, but there's also the job and wealth creation agenda, which the NHS needs to be part of. And certainly in relation to some things we've not talked about, a year ago at this conference, genomics, precision medicine was a major part of that. That's still developing. Given we're leaving the European Union, our worldwide role in advanced medical treatment and care and research is ever more critical. Our role in terms of genomics and encouraging all of that, and certainly Leeds as a centre of that, that's very important to us. So I think local authorities can help get involved in helping support and back, with other partners like universities, place-based plans that don't just rely on the NHS coffers, that can find ways of, imaginative ways, with commercial partners of making change also. So on a whole range of levels, it's absolutely critical.
Amanda, for the view from the other side of the Pennines.
Yes, so I think it's not just about links with local authorities and oversight by local authorities. Local authorities need to be absolutely embedded as key members of our STP governance arrangements and our practical arrangements. Genomics, hospitals, all of that stuff's all very well. You come to my part of the world, the reason our maternity outcomes are poor is because 1/3 of our women smoke throughout their pregnancy. And if I could do one thing, it wouldn't be reconfigure neonatal intensive care and maternity, it would be do something about smoking. The local authorities commission public health services. The public health grant has been absolutely stripped back. It's making it impossible for us. We've got to align ourselves with the commissioners of services and providers of service who align with our agenda. So that's public health services as well as social care services. And local authorities need to be in there with us, giving us democratic legitimacy. If we bring clinical legitimacy and democratic legitimacy together, we will effect change. There's no doubt about it. And we really need to be doing that.
Right. Sign number 1 has moved.
So, Paul Jenkins, Chief Executive of the Tavistock and Portman, and you might say that I would make this point, wouldn't I? But given the agenda around hope, not fear, given the participation of young people in last week's election in numbers that we haven't seen recently, and given the great political consensus there now seems to be around the issue of mental health, is not now the time actually to make a real acceleration of plans around parity of steam, to make the investment that follows those plans much more visible and transparent than it has been in the past, and to put mental health much more at the centre of the agenda?
It's hard to argue with that, isn't it?
It is very hard to argue with it. The parity of esteem, I always think, is parity of importance between mental and physical health is a case, as Nigel says, who's going to argue against it? Please put your hand up. What we then have to do is to walk the walk rather than just talk the talk. What does it mean in practice? How do we deliver mental health services that relieve the system of the physical health conditions that have mental health roots, as well as addressing the mental health issues for their own sakes? Those are their issues that are not just issues for the health service, but for the whole of the public sector. I speak as a trustee of Place to Be, which delivers mental health services in schools. If we cut the schools budget, people present at CAMHS, and then we wonder why we can't manage the demand pressures on CAMHS. So it's a public sector-wide commitment, not just a health service commitment. Nigel, I've given you some thinking time.
Yes, and it's not about mental health. We've definitely neglected children and young people's mental health. But actually, I think if you look at the policy agenda at the moment and the NHS's agenda, children and young people are almost completely absent from it more generally, actually. We've entirely focused on the chronically ill older adult, which, and for very good reasons, obviously, but it does strike, we have some very, very poor outcomes for children. internationally. We are really lagging behind the rest of Europe on infant mortality, on obesity, on a whole number of things. They're drinking less, that's the good news, but they appear to be eating more. They're exercising less. Their educational achievement is not going the way it should. They're amongst some of the most anxious of young people in international studies, and they seem to have dropped off a bit. And I just wonder the mental health neglect actually is part of a wider neglect of children and young people in the way that we're thinking about policy at the moment.
Amanda.
Discuss.
Just about mental health. We talk about parity of esteem and we talk about mental health as though it's a thing. When we talk about physical health, we talk about ischemic heart disease and COPD and diabetes and cancer and have massive programs for all of them. Mental health has as many different diseases, illnesses, preventative strategies, inputs required, and we lump it all into one thing and say, treat us equally. We need to stop doing that. We need to recognise that it's a whole spectrum of health and disease that has different approaches needed that we need to tackle properly. We need a proper prevention strategy, and parity of esteem will mean doing all those things, not just saying we take mental health as seriously as physical health.
And can I just add a point, because it's not just about the mainstream mental health services. I'm reminded we had an event at the Fund about a month ago on social prescribing. And it was a very powerful talk by somebody who'd had a mental health problem, very severe mental health problem, who'd exhausted all the conventional treatment options within the NHS. And what transformed her life was actually going to an art class and having the opportunity to learn to paint and starting to exhibit her paintings, to sell them. Her whole life has been turned around. This is her story, not my story. Not by going into an excellent mental health service, but by exploring these wider alternatives. And there'll be many stories like that of how we need to think, literally outside the box. Mental health, physical health. What are the range of things that Wanderless and others many years ago have said we need to give much more priority to?
And just to prove that I'm not discriminating against number 4, right up at the back, the last question, please.
Yeah, thank you. Tim Cotton, GP in West Hampshire. I just wanted to ask the panel, we have a weakened government and they've got other agendas like Brexit. Does that pose opportunities? We've seen negative, but we talk about hope. How can we act, how can we behave in this political environment that will get the NHS high up on the agenda?
I spent most of my working life in politics. A politician is almost defined as somebody who will find an opportunity in whatever set of circumstances you create. So, Nigel, are you going to be a politician in this country?
No, probably not. No, I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
Well, there's a balance sheet, isn't there, here? On one hand, there is an anti-austerity vote. So it would be strange if that didn't flow through somehow to some priorities of the next government, certainly in the spending plans. On the other hand, we know that there are, I think, 30 seats, I read, where there's less than a 2,000 majority. So under those circumstances, anything that rocks the boat is going to cause immense trouble with respect to reconfiguration and so on. So some things maybe get better, some things may get harder. The question, politicians are there to achieve the art of the possible. They are meant so let's see whether our current ministers are up to this, and I actually honestly think the biggest thing in their in tray is not NHS funding, although that is a big issue. It's what are they now going to do that somehow eases the configuration decisions that are now we now want to do. That is their job, and I think that's what's really interesting. That's not a major feature of the current mandate. If you look at it and look at what they say there about public involvement in reconfiguration, it hardly features. So that really has to come right up the agenda, I think, if they think that reconfiguration is going to be the route to nirvana of this squeeze, and that is an if.
But Amanda, isn't part of the conversation that took place between Julian and the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board earlier, that is part of where the opportunity lies? If Whitehall's focused on Brexit and somebody solves a problem locally, are they really going to intervene to stop you doing something that works better?
Well, you would hope not. You never know. No, that's the key. We know what we need to do. There are things that make it harder for us to do it, and there are things that could be done to ease it, but probably none of that's going to change. We need to get our head down and work around the system we've got, using the resources we've got and any extra we can manage to get to deliver collaboratively what we all know we need to do.
So I think the opportunity for the NHS, going to your question, is to get on and do what the NHS is already doing. Surely, if there's going to be less political intervention and fewer political initiatives, because the legislation and the majority in Parliament doesn't exist to make that happen in the way it did, say, in 2010, then we've got a plan. It's called the 5-year forward view. Maybe it becomes the 8-year forward view, or whatever the time period should be. And without as much political intervention, there's an opportunity for NHS leaders like Amanda and Julian to carry on the work through the STPs and to make the further changes that we need. It has to be about that reform alongside that investment.
I completely agree with that. I think that it's a phrase I quite often use: seek forgiveness, not permission.
Yeah.
And if they're focused on something else, they're not going to obstruct you if you've got a problem and you try to solve it. So I think the answer to the question is there's an opportunity for people to get on and do it.
That's right.
Yes. Okay. On that note of optimism at the end of the first day of Confederation 17, would you please say thank you to our panel, and we hope you have a good evening and come back tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Red Cross have collection buckets for the UK Charities Solidarity Fund to help people affected by the terrorist attacks in the UK. Collection buckets will be at the doors as you leave the auditorium. Please also make your way to fringe sessions on the upper level. Thank you.